A black woman, owner of a small bookstore, began receiving anonymous love letters. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the unmistakable smell of old books, creating a cozy atmosphere that enveloped every corner of Stories from the Heart. Zoe Carter took a deep breath, letting the familiar fragrance fill her lungs as she ran her fingers gently over the spine of a worn novel. The bookshop was more than her business. It was a lifelong dream materialized in oak shelves and faded Persian rugs. Outside, the streets of Traverse City, Michigan, were beginning to awaken under the warm June sun. Early morning tourists were already wandering along Front Street, admiring the charming stores and cafes that made the city such a beloved destination. But for Zoe, the real treasure was there, among the yellowed pages and the stories waiting to be discovered. While organizing a new shipment of books, Zoe couldn't help but smile as she thought about how her life had changed in recent years. At 32, she finally felt she was on the right track, living the life she had always dreamed of. Of course, not everything was perfect. The shadow of a new bookstore chain threatening to set up shop in the city hung over her thoughts. But Zoe was determined not to let it overshadow her joy. "Good morning, Ms. Literature." The cheerful voice of Lisa, her best friend and only employee, echoed through the empty store. "Ready for another day of adventures between the pages?" Zoe laughed, shaking her head. "Lisa, you know you don't have to come in so early. The store doesn't open until 9. "And miss the chance to have the best coffee in town?" "No way," Lisa replied, raising her coffee cup. "Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't get lost among the books and forget to open the store." The two laughed together, a friendship forged over the years, since their college days. Lisa, with her red hair always tousled and freckles dancing across her face, was Zoe's opposite in many ways. While Zoe was reserved and reflective, Lisa was outgoing and impulsive. However, they shared an unconditional love of literature and a fierce loyalty to each other. "So, any exciting news?" Lisa asked, sitting down at the counter and swinging her legs like an eager child. Zoe was about to answer when something caught her eye. Between the pages of the book she was holding, a cream envelope stood out. Intrigued, she gently pulled it out. "What's this?" Lisa leaned forward, curious. Carefully, Zoe opened the envelope and took out a folded sheet of paper. As she unfolded it, her eyes traced the lines written in elegant calligraphy. "In the pages of time, I find your gaze, a smile that illuminates more than moonlight. Between verse and prose, my heart is lost in the freedom of your being, which transcends everything." Zoe felt her heart race. The poem was beautiful, touching, and anonymous. "Wow!" Lisa exclaimed, reading over Zoe's shoulder. "Looks like someone has a secret admirer." "Don't be silly," Zoe replied, trying to hide the blush spreading across her cheeks. "It's probably just some customer who forgot it here." But even as she said this, Zoe couldn't help feeling butterflies in her stomach. Who had written those touching words? The sound of the doorbell interrupted her thoughts. David Matthews, the charming chef from the restaurant next door, entered the bookshop with his characteristic smile. "Good morning, neighbor," he greeted, his green eyes shining with a mixture of kindness and something else that Zoe couldn't decipher. "I've come to see if you have any new French cookery books. I'm thinking of adding some classic dishes to the menu." Zoe quickly tucked the letter into her apron pocket, hoping David hadn't noticed. "Of course, David. I think I have just what you need." As she moved between the shelves, aware of David's gaze following her, Zoe couldn't help thinking about the letter. Was it possible that... No. She pushed the thought away. David was just a good friend and neighbor. Nothing more. The next few hours passed in a blur of clients, book recommendations, and lively conversations. But the letter remained in her mind, a constant presence that made her smile at the most unexpected moments. In the afternoon, When the bustle in the store died down, Zoe found herself staring at the window, lost in thought. Across the street, an eye-catching sign announced, "Coming soon. Mega Books, the largest bookstore chain in the country." The reality of the threat hanging over her small business came back full force. How could she compete with a large corporation? Stories from the Heart was more than a store. It was a refuge, a place where people came not just to buy books, but to share stories, find comfort and inspiration. "Hey, don't let this get you down," Lisa's soft voice interrupted his dark thoughts. "Our store has something no big chain will ever have. You." Zoe smiled gratefully at her friend. "Thank you, Lisa. Sometimes I wonder if I'm being silly trying to keep this place going." "Foolish? You?" Lisa laughed. "Zoe Carter, you're the most determined and passionate person I know. If anyone can keep this store alive, it's you." Lisa's words warmed Zoe's heart, reminding her why she had fought so hard to make her dream come true. She looked around the store, at the shelves full of stories waiting to be discovered, at the cozy corners where customers could lose themselves for hours, and at the small cafe at the back, where the aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the smell of books. "You're right," Zoe said, straightening her shoulders. "I'm not going to give up without a fight." At that moment, as if the universe wanted to reaffirm her decision, the doorbell rang again. A young woman entered, her eyes shining with excitement. "Excuse me," she said shyly. "I hear this is the best bookstore in town to find poetry books. I'm looking for something special for my grandmother." Zoe smiled, feeling refreshed. "You've come to the right place. Let me show you some of our favorite collections." As she guided the customer through the shelves, sharing her recommendations and the stories behind each book, Zoe felt her passion for her work reignite. The mysterious letter in her pocket seemed to pulsate, reminding her that there was still magic and mystery in the world. At the end of the day, after closing the store and saying goodbye to Lisa, Zoe walked slowly home, the streets of Traverse City quiet in the twilight. The fresh Lake Michigan air caressed her face, bringing with it promises of new beginnings. At home, she took the letter out of her pocket and reread it, letting the words dance in her mind. Whoever had written it had touched something deep in her soul. For the first time in a long time, Zoe allowed herself to dream not only of the success of her bookshop, but of the possibility of a love that understood her completely. With a smile on her lips, she fell asleep, the verses of the letter echoing in her dreams, mingling with images of books, smiling customers, and, curiously, David's gentle smile. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new possibilities. And Zoe was ready to embrace every one of them. The aroma of freshly baked croissants filled the morning air in Traverse City. David Matthews adjusted his apron, noting with satisfaction the line forming outside his restaurant. Le Petit Chateau. The Michigan sun was shining over the lake, promising another glorious summer's day. While preparing the mise en place for lunch, David couldn't get the image of Zoe holding that mysterious letter out of his mind. He had noticed the blush on her cheeks, the sparkle in her brown eyes. A pang of jealousy hit him, surprising him with its intensity. "Chef, we have a problem with the cheese supplier," announced his sous chef, Olivia, interrupting his thoughts. David sighed, forcing himself back to the present. "What happened this time?" "They couldn't get the comté you asked for the new dish," Olivia explained, frowning. "They suggested replacing it with Gruyere." No, David muttered, running his hand through his dark hair. "It won't taste the same. I'm going to have to rethink today's whole menu." While David lost himself in calculations and substitutions, his mind wandered to the past, to summers in Paris, learning from the best chefs in Europe, to his dreams of having his own Michelin-starred restaurant. and to the voice of his mother, Alexandra, echoing in his ears. "David, darling, you have the potential to be one of the greatest chefs in the world. Don't waste your talent in a small country town." The phone rang, snapping him out of his reverie. It was her. "Mom," David answered, trying to keep his voice neutral. "David, my love." Alexandra's melodious voice sounded on the other end of the line. "How's my favorite starred chef?" David took a deep breath. "I'm fine, Mom. The restaurant is as full as ever." "Oh, how wonderful," she replied. But David could feel the but coming on. "You know, I was talking to Jean-Pierre Dubois. You remember him, don't you? The owner of that restaurant chain in New York? Well, he mentioned that he's looking for an executive chef for his new venture in Chicago. I immediately thought of you, darling." David's stomach contracted. Chicago, a big city, renowned restaurants, important critics. Everything he'd always dreamed of, or at least, everything his mother had always dreamed of for him. "Mom, I appreciate it, but I'm happy here in Traverse City. Le Petit Chateau is doing well, and "David," Alexandra interrupted him, her voice now with a touch of impatience. "You can't stay holed up in this little town forever. Think of your future, of the legacy you could build." Before David could reply, the back doorbell rang. Through the kitchen window, he saw Zoe standing outside, holding a basket. "Mom, I have to go." "I've got customers waiting," he said quickly. "We'll talk later, okay?" Hanging up the phone before Alexandra could protest, David ran to the back door, his heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with the rush from the kitchen. "Zoe!" he exclaimed, an involuntary smile forming on his lips. What a nice surprise. Zoe smiled back, her eyes shining with what seemed to be a mixture of nervousness and excitement. "Hey, David, I hope I'm not in the way." "You? Never," he replied, perhaps a little too quickly. Sniffling, he continued, "What brings you here so early?" Zoe lifted the basket she was carrying. "Well, I was rearranging some shelves in the bookshop and I found this." She pulled out an old book with a worn leather cover. "It's a French recipe book from the 19th century. I thought you might like to have a look." David took the book reverently, his fingers brushing Zoe's for a moment. An electric current seemed to pass between them. "Zoe, this is amazing," he murmured, flipping through the yellowed pages carefully. "Where did you get it?" "It was hidden behind some novels. I think it was forgotten there for years," she explained, watching David's amazed expression. "I thought of you immediately when I saw it." David's heart leapt. She was thinking of him. "That's very kind of you," he said, trying to keep his composure. "Why don't you come in? I can buy you a coffee and maybe we can have a look around together." Zoe hesitated for a moment, her eyes turning to the bookshop across the street. "I'd love to, but I need to open the store soon." "Of course," David replied, trying to hide his disappointment. "Well, how about dinner here tonight? I can prepare something inspired by this book as a thank you." Zoe's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, David feared he had been too bold. But then a shy smile spread across her face. "That would be wonderful," she replied softly. As they said goodbye, with the promise of dinner hanging between them, David couldn't help noticing how the morning sun made Zoe's dark curls shine, how her eyes seemed to contain all the brown tones of autumn. Back in the kitchen, David found himself energized in a way that no coffee could provide. Worries about suppliers and his mother's expectations seemed distant now. "Olivia," he called to his sous chef, "change of plans for today's menu. We're going to do something special." As he lost himself in the pages of the old book, David wondered if Zoe had any idea of the impact she made on him. Every smile, every casual conversation, seemed to light up his world in a way that no food critic's praise ever could. The day passed in a whirlwind of preparations and expectations. As evening approached, David found himself looking out of the kitchen window in the direction of Stories from the Heart. He watched Zoe interacting with the customers, her face lighting up as she discussed books, shared recommendations, and laughed with her friend Lisa. It was then that he noticed the sign. "Grand opening coming soon. Mega Books, your new home of literature," was written in huge letters across the street. David saw the exact moment when Zoe noticed it too. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and even from a distance, he could sense her concern. Determination grew within him. Tonight wouldn't just be about dinner or a thank you for the book. It would be about showing Zoe that she wasn't alone, that her passion and dedication were appreciated, not just by her clients, but by him too. When the last lunch customer left, David began preparations for the special dinner. Each dish was carefully chosen from the old book, but with a modern twist that he hoped would impress Zoe. At 7 p.m. sharp, the doorbell rang. David took a deep breath, straightened his chef's uniform, and went to greet his special guest. Zoe looked stunning in a simple but elegant dress. Her curls were loose, framing her face in a way that made David's heart skip a beat. "Welcome to Le Petit Chateau," he said, giving an exaggerated bow that drew a laugh from Zoe. "Thank you, Chef Matthews," she replied, entering the now empty restaurant decorated just for her. As he guided her to the table, David couldn't help but notice how she seemed to belong there, as if she had always been a part of his life. "So," Zoe began, her eyes shining with curiosity, "what has the great chef prepared tonight?" David smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Well, thanks to a certain mysterious book that appeared in my hands, we have a culinary journey through 19th century France in store for us." As he served the first course, a reimagined onion soup au gratin, David found himself wishing that this moment could last forever. The conversation flowed easily between them, moving from books to food, from childhood dreams to hopes for the future. It was only when they were enjoying dessert, a cherry clafoutis with a hint of lavender, that David mustered up the courage to broach the subject that was bothering him. "Zoe," he began hesitantly, "I saw the poster today about the new bookshop." Zoe's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly pulled herself together. "Oh, well, I suppose a bit of healthy competition never hurt anyone, right?" David could see the concern behind her words. "You know you're not alone in this, don't you? Heart Stories is special. It's the heart of this community. No big network can replace that." Zoe's eyes filled with unshed tears. "Thank you, David. That means a lot to me." At that moment, watching Zoe in the candlelight, David felt something change inside him. His mother's expectations, his dreams of culinary stardom, all seemed insignificant compared to his desire to see Zoe smile, to protect and support her. As the evening drew to a close and they said goodbye outside the restaurant, David felt the weight of the letter he had written in his pocket. The letter he hadn't had the heart to deliver, but which contained all the words his heart longed to say. "Good evening, Zoe," he said softly. "And thank you, not just for the book, but for everything." Zoe smiled, a smile that lit up the night around her. "Good night, David, and thank you. Tonight was magical." As he watched her walk back home, David made a silent promise. He would find a way to help Zoe save her bookshop, and perhaps, in the process, he would find the courage to reveal his true feelings. With one last look at Stories from the Heart across the street, David returned to his kitchen, his refuge, with a heart full of hope and determination. The future was uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure. Zoe Carter had become the most important ingredient in his life, and he would do anything not to lose her. Morning arrived in Traverse City with a soft mist hanging over Lake Michigan. Zoe woke up with a light heart, the memories of dinner with David still vivid in her mind. She stretched, an involuntary smile forming on her lips as she replayed every moment of the night before. As she prepared for another day at the bookstore, Zoe couldn't help but notice how the colors seemed more vibrant, how the air seemed sweeter. It was as if the world was in tune with the joy bubbling up inside her. When she arrived at Stories from the Heart, however, reality hit her hard. The sign announcing the arrival of megabooks looked bigger and more menacing in the morning light. Zoe took a deep breath, determined not to let it overshadow her good mood. "Good morning, sunshine." Lisa's cheerful voice greeted her as soon as she entered the store. "Someone seems to have had an interesting evening." Zoe blushed, trying to hide her smile as she hung up her coat. "It was just dinner, Lisa. No big deal." "Oh, really?" Lisa arched an eyebrow, a mischievous smile on her lips. "And that's why you're practically glowing this morning." Before Zoe could answer, the doorbell rang. A tall man in a well-cut suit entered the store, his eyes scanning the room with an air of appraisal. "Good morning, ladies," he said, his voice soft but with a tone of authority. "I'm looking for the owner, Zoe Carter." Zoe stepped forward, holding out her hand. "It's me. What can I do for you?" The man smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Marcus Wellington, from Mega Books. It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Ms. Carter." Zoe's heart sank. So this was the face behind the threat to her beloved bookshop. "Mr. Wellington," she replied, keeping her composure. "What brings you to our humble store?" Marcus looked around once more, his eyes lingering on the cozy corners and the shelves full of carefully selected books. "I've come to make you an offer, Ms. Carter, one that I believe will be beneficial to both of us." Zoe exchanged a quick glance with Lisa, who looked as apprehensive as she felt. "Why don't we talk in my office?" As she guided Marcus to the back of the store, Zoe felt as if she were leading a wolf into its den. The office was small, cozy, with walls covered in posters of classic books and an antique desk she had inherited from her grandfather. "So, Mr. Wellington," Zoe began, taking a seat behind the desk. "What is this proposal?" Marcus settled into the chair opposite, his gaze assessing every detail of the space. "Ms. Carter, I'll be blunt. Megabooks is expanding rapidly, and Traverse City is a market we're very interested in. Your bookstore, well, it has charm. I can't deny that. But the future lies with the big chains, with a wide range and competitive prices." Zoe felt a knot forming in her stomach. "And where exactly do I fit into this future?" "We want to buy your bookshop," Marcus said, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather. "We're offering a fair price, well above market value. What's more, we're willing to offer you a management position in our new store. Your local knowledge would be invaluable." For a moment, Zoe was speechless. The offer was tempting, she had to admit. The money would solve many of her financial worries, and the security of a job in a big company. But then memories flooded her mind. Her grandmother's smile when she told her about her dream of opening a bookshop. The countless customers who have become friends over the years. The feeling of accomplishment every time he helped someone find the perfect book. And, most recently, the look of admiration in David's eyes when he talked about how special Stories from the Heart was. "Mr. Wellington," Zoe began, her voice firm, "I appreciate your offer, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to decline it. This bookshop is not just a business for me. It's a dream, a legacy, a vital part of this community." Marcus didn't seem surprised by the refusal. He just smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I understand your emotional attachment, Ms. Carter, but I suggest you think carefully. The market is changing, and small independent bookshops are becoming obsolete. Our offer won't stay on the table forever." With that, he stood up, adjusting his jacket. "Think about it. I'll be in town for a few more days. Here's my card in case you change your mind." After Marcus left, Zoe remained seated, his card weighing on her hand as if it were made of lead. The reality of the situation hit her full force. Mega Books wasn't just a distant threat now. It was real, tangible, and determined. Lisa walked into the office, worry on her face. "Zoe, is everything all right? What did he want?" Zoe looked up, feeling suddenly exhausted. "They want to buy the bookshop, Lisa. They've offered good money and even a job for me." "What?" Lisa exclaimed, shocked. "You're not considering it, are you?" "Of course not," Zoe replied, but her voice betrayed a hint of doubt. "But what if they're right? What if small bookshops like ours really are doomed to fail?" Lisa knelt beside Zoe's chair, taking her hands. "Hey, look at me. This bookstore is special. It's more than just a business. It's the heart of this community. No big chain can replace what we have here." Lisa's words echoed those of David the night before, bringing Zoe a little comfort. She squeezed her friend's hands, grateful for her support. "You're right," Zoe said, a new fire igniting in her eyes. "Let's not give up without a fight." The rest of the day passed in a blur of clients and books, but Zoe's mind was far away, planning, trying to find a way to compete with the corporate giant that threatened to swallow her dream. When night finally fell and it was time to close up store, Zoe found herself hesitating at the door. The thought of going home to silence and solitude seemed unbearable at that moment. Almost without thinking, her feet led her to Le Petit Chateau. The kitchen lights were still on, and through the window, she could see David at work, completely absorbed in his culinary art. Zoe knocked softly on the back door. When David saw her, his face lit up in a way that made her heart race. "Zoe," he exclaimed, opening the door. "What a pleasant surprise. Is everything all right?" She hesitated for a moment, feeling suddenly vulnerable. I've had a hard day. I guess I just needed to see a friendly face." David's expression softened, concern evident in his eyes. "Come in. I'll make us some tea." As she settled onto a stool in the kitchen, watching David move gracefully between the stoves and worktops, Zoe felt a wave of calm wash over her. There was something comforting in the familiarity of that space, in the aromas that hung in the air, in David's quiet presence. "Do you want to talk about what happened?" David asked softly, placing a steaming cup of chamomile tea in front of her. Zoe took a sip, letting the warmth of the drink warm her up inside. Then the words began to flow. She told David about Marcus' visit, about the offer from Mega Books, about her fears and doubts. David listened intently, his eyes never leaving hers. When Zoe finished, he was silent for a moment, as if he were carefully considering his next words. "Zoe," he began, his voice full of emotion, "you are the most passionate and dedicated person I have ever met. Heart Stories isn't just a bookshop. It's an extension of who you are. It's a place of magic, of discoveries, of connections. No large chain can replicate that." He paused, taking her hands in his. "I believe in you, and I'm not alone in that. This whole community believes in you and what your bookshop stands for." David's words touched something deep inside Zoe. Tears she didn't even know she was holding back began to fall. "Thank you," she whispered, squeezing his hands. That means a lot to me." There was a moment of silence between them, charged with unspoken emotion. Zoe could feel her heart beating fast, aware of David's closeness, of the warmth of his hands. It was then that her eyes settled on a piece of paper on the worktop. The handwriting was unmistakable. the same as the mysterious letters she had received. "David," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "That handwriting." David's eyes followed hers, and she saw the exact moment when he realized what she had noticed. His face paled, and he quickly let go of her hands. "Zoe, But before he could continue, the kitchen phone rang shrilly, breaking the moment. David stared at the handset as if it were a snake about to strike. I need to take this," he said, his voice shaking. "It's probably my mom. She's been calling a lot lately." Zoe nodded, feeling suddenly disoriented. As David answered the phone, speaking in a low, tense voice, she tried to process what she had just discovered. David was the author of the letters. The man who had made her dream, who had touched her heart with poetic words, was there, just a few steps away from her. When David hung up the phone, there was an expression of conflict on his face. "Zoe, But she interrupted him, standing up abruptly. "It's getting late. I should go." "Wait," David said, taking a step towards her. "Please let me explain." Zoe hesitated, her heart in turmoil. Part of her wanted to stay, to hear what David had to say. But another part was frightened by the intensity of what she was feeling. "Tomorrow," she finally said. "We can talk tomorrow." With that, she quickly left the kitchen, the cool night air hitting her warm face. As she walked home, her mind whirled with thoughts of threatened bookstores, giant corporations, and secret love letters. One thing was certain: life in Traverse City was about to get a lot more complicated. Dawn brought with it a storm, the dark clouds hanging over Traverse City like an omen. Zoe watched the raindrops drip down her bedroom window, her mood as gray as the sky outside. It had been a long night, filled with tumultuous thoughts about David, the letters, and the uncertain future of her beloved bookstore. With a sigh, she forced herself up. Stories from the Heart wasn't going to open on its own, and Zoe knew she needed to keep her head up, especially now. Arriving at the bookstore, Zoe was greeted by Lisa, who immediately noticed her mood. Oh, Lisa said, frowning. "I know that look. What happened?" Zoe hesitated, not knowing where to start. "It's complicated. Complicated like that Russian novel you're always trying to get me to read. Or complicated like, I found out my cat neighbor is actually an international spy," Lisa joked, trying to get a smile out of Zoe. Despite herself, Zoe laughed. "More on the side of Russian romance, I guess." She paused, looking around to make sure no customers had come in. "David, he's the author of the letters." Lisa's eyes widened. "What? How did you find out?" Zoe told her about the night before, about seeing David's handwriting and his reaction. "And now, I don't know what to think or feel. Why didn't he tell me? Why all this mystery?" Lisa put a comforting hand on Zoe's shoulder. "Oh dear, men sometimes do stupid things when they're in love. Maybe he was afraid to open up completely." "Maybe," Zoe murmured, not entirely convinced. "But with everything that's going on with Megabooks, I don't know if I can handle any more complications in my life right now." As if summoned by her words, the doorbell rang, and Marcus Wellington entered, waving an umbrella. "Good morning, ladies," he greeted with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Awful weather, isn't it?" Zoe straightened her shoulders, determined not to show weakness. "Mr. Wellington, what can I do for you today?" Marcus looked around the almost empty store. "I just stopped by to see if you'd reconsidered our offer. Days like this must be tough for small businesses." Before Zoe could reply, the door opened again. David walked in, his dark hair wet from the rain, his eyes immediately meeting Zoe's. The air in the bookshop felt electrifying. The air in the bookshop seemed to become electrically charged. Zoe felt her heart racing, a mixture of emotions, joy, hurt, confusion, flooding her chest. "Sorry. I didn't know you were busy," David said, his voice tense. His eyes turned to Marcus, an expression of distrust crossing his face. Marcus, for his part, looked puzzled by David's arrival. "Ah, you must be Chef Matthews. I've heard great things about your restaurant." David nodded stiffly. "Thank you. And you are—" "Marcus Wellington, from Mega Books," he replied, holding out his hand. "We're about to open a branch here in Traverse City." David's expression hardened visibly. He shook Marcus' hand briefly, before turning to Zoe. "Can I talk to you for a moment? In private?" Zoe hesitated, torn between her desire to hear what David had to say and her reluctance to leave Marcus alone in his store. "Why don't we go to my office?" she finally suggested. Turning to Marcus, she added, "Mr. Wellington, if you could excuse us for a few minutes." Marcus smiled, that cold, calculating smile that made Zoe feel uncomfortable. Of course. I'll take the opportunity to look through the books. Always good to meet the competition." In the small office at the back of the store, Zoe and David stood face to face, the air heavy with unspoken words. "Zoe, David began, running a hand through his damp hair. "About last night. About the letters. I wanted to tell you, but it never seemed to be the right time." Zoe crossed her arms, a protective barrier against the storm of emotions that threatened to overflow. "Why, David? Why the anonymous letters? Why not just talk to me?" David took a step forward, his eyes pleading for understanding. "Because you scare me, Zoe. What I feel for you, it's stronger, deeper than anything I've ever felt. And with all the pressure from my mother, the expectations, I thought that if I could express my feelings through letters, it would be safer for both of us." Zoe felt her resolve waver. The vulnerability in David's voice, the sincerity in his eyes. It was hard to keep her guard up. "David, But before she could continue, a shout from the store interrupted them. "Zoe, you need to see this!" Alarmed, Zoe ran back into the store, David right behind her. What they found made their hearts sink. Marcus was standing near the shop window, a triumphant smile on his face. Outside, through the rain, they could see a huge banner being unfurled on the building across the street. "Mega Books, grand opening in 30 days. "Well," Marcus said, his voice brimming with false sympathy, "it looks like time is running out. Miss Carter. Perhaps it's time to reconsider my offer." Zoe felt as if the ground was disappearing beneath her feet. 30 days. How could she compete with a giant corporation in just 30 days? It was then that she felt a warm, firm hand on her back. David was at her side, his face determined. "She doesn't need to reconsider anything," he said, his voice filled with a confidence that Zoe wasn't feeling. "Heart Stories is more than just a bookshop. It's the heart of this community, and we're going to fight for it." Marcus arched an eyebrow, clearly not impressed. "Noble sentiment, Chef Matthews. But business is business, and in the end, it's profit that matters." With a nod, Marcus left the store, leaving behind a heavy silence. Zoe turned to David, unshed tears glistening in her eyes. "What are we going to do?" David pulled her into a tight hug, and Zoe allowed herself to sink into his warmth for a moment. "Let's fight," he murmured into her hair. "Together." In that instant, with the rain falling outside and the world seeming to crumble around them, Zoe felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. Perhaps, with David by her side, they could find a way to save the bookshop. The rest of the day passed in a blur of frenetic activity. Zoe, David, and Lisa gathered around the small table in the office, brainstorming ideas to attract more customers and compete with Megabooks. "What if we held a literary festival?" Lisa suggested, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "We could invite local authors, have readings, writing workshops." "That's brilliant, Lisa," Zoe exclaimed, feeling excited for the first time in days. "And we could partner with other local businesses. David, you could prepare dishes inspired by famous books." David nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "I love the idea. We could turn it into an event for the whole community. Show everyone what makes Traverse City and Stories from the Heart so special." As they continued to plan, Zoe felt a wave of gratitude for having such incredible people in her life. Lisa, with her unwavering loyalty and creative ideas. And David, who had touched her heart with poetic words and was now by her side, ready to fight. As night fell and the storm finally began to subside, Zoe found herself alone with David again. Lisa had gone home, leaving the two of them to finalize some details. "David," Zoe began, her voice soft, "about the letters." He looked at her, his eyes full of emotion. "Zoe, I know I've complicated things, but every word I wrote was true. You brighten my days, inspire my creativity, make me want to be a better person." Zoe felt her heart race. The letters meant a lot to me. Knowing they were from you just makes them even more special." David took a step towards her, hesitantly. "So, you're not mad at me?" She smiled, shaking her head. "No, confused, perhaps. A little hurt that you didn't tell me sooner, but not angry." He reached out, gently touching her face. "I promise that, from now on, I'll be completely honest with you. No more secrets." Zoe leaned into his touch, closing her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, she saw David looking at her with such tenderness that it almost took her breath away. Slowly, as if they were in a dream, they moved closer. Their lips met in a soft kiss, full of promise and hope. When they broke apart, Zoe laughed softly. "Well, I guess that complicates things even more." David smiled, stroking her cheek. "Maybe, but I think it's worth it." That evening, as Zoe walked home under a sky that was finally beginning to lighten, she felt a mixture of fear and hope. The next 30 days would undoubtedly be a challenge. But with David by her side and the support of her community, she was ready to face whatever came. Stories from the Heart was more than just a bookshop. It was a dream, a legacy, a place of love and connection, and Zoe was determined to fight for it with everything she had. The sun rose over Traverse City, its golden rays dispelling the last vestiges of the previous day's storm. Zoe woke up with a new determination shining in her eyes. The last few days had been a roller coaster of emotions, but now she had a clear purpose: to save Stories from the Heart and prove that the heart of a community could not be bought by a large corporation. Upon arriving at the bookstore, Zoe was greeted by a sight that stopped her in her tracks. A line of people stretched down the sidewalk, all eagerly awaiting the opening of the store. "What's going on?" she muttered to herself, hurrying to unlock the door. Lisa was already inside, a beaming smile on her face. "Surprise!" she exclaimed. "I've been on social media all night, telling everyone about our situation and the literary festival we're planning. The response has been incredible." Zoe felt a wave of emotion wash over her. "Lisa, you're amazing!" As customers poured in, Zoe was touched by the comments of support and encouragement, people she had known for years and even some she had never seen before, all expressing their love for Heart Stories and their desire to help. In the middle of the morning, the doorbell rang, announcing David's arrival. He was carrying a covered basket and had a mischievous twinkle in his eyes. "Good morning, ladies," he greeted, approaching the counter where Zoe and Lisa were standing. "I've brought a little incentive for our loyal customers." He uncovered the basket, revealing dozens of mini blueberry muffins, still warm from the oven. The delicious aroma spread through the store, making everyone's stomachs growl with anticipation. "David, this is wonderful," Zoe exclaimed, feeling touched by the gesture. He smiled, leaning over to give her a quick kiss on the cheek. "It's only the beginning. I've been thinking about the festival, and I've come up with a few ideas that I'd like to discuss with you." As Lisa handed out the muffins to the grateful customers, Zoe and David retreated to a quiet corner of the store. "So, what do you have in mind?" Zoe asked, curious. David's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. "What if we turned the festival into a celebration of Traverse City's history and culture? We could have local authors talk about the region, partner with other businesses to create unique experiences. Imagine a literary tour of the city, with stops at places mentioned in famous books set here." Zoe felt her heart fill with hope and excitement. "David, that's brilliant. We could really show what makes our community special." They spent the next hour sketching out ideas, their faces close as they pored over a notebook. The energy between them was palpable, a mixture of shared creativity and undeniable attraction. However, their bubble of happiness was burst by the sound of the door opening wide. Marcus Wellington entered, his cold gaze sweeping the crowded store. "Well, well," he said, his voice laden with false surprise. "Looks like someone's having a lucky day." Zoe stood up, determined not to let Marcus intimidate her. "Mr. Wellington, as you can see, we're busy today. Is there anything specific I can help you with?" Marcus smiled, but the gesture didn't reach his eyes. "Just dropping by to see how things are going. I see you're making an effort. It's touching, really." David stood next to Zoe, his presence a source of silent strength. "Heart Stories has the support of the whole community, Mr. Wellington. Something money can't buy." Marcus' smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly pulled himself together. "Ah, yes, the community. A lovely concept, isn't it? But in the end, the numbers don't lie. And speaking of numbers," he pulled an envelope from his inside jacket pocket. "I have a revised offer for you, Ms. Carter. I suggest you read it carefully. The market is changing rapidly, and opportunities like this don't come along every day." Zoe took the envelope with trembling fingers, feeling its weight as if it were made of lead. "Thank you, Mr. Wellington. I'll consider it." Marcus nodded, satisfied. "That's all I ask." "Oh, and good luck with your festival. I'm sure it will be a lovely event." With that, he turned and left, leaving behind a tense silence. As soon as the door closed behind Marcus, Lisa approached. "What was that about a revised offer?" Zoe looked at the envelope in her hands, feeling suddenly exhausted. "I don't know, but I'm afraid to find out." David put a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to open it now. In fact, you don't have to open it at all if you don't want to." Zoe shook her head, straightening her shoulders. "No, I need to know what we're up against. But not here. Not now." The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. The store remained busy, with customers expressing their support in every way possible. Some bought extra books, others left donations for the festival, and many simply shared stories about what stories from the heart meant to them. When it was finally time to close, Zoe, David, and Lisa were exhausted but excited. The first day of their battle against megabooks had been an undeniable success. "So," Lisa said, smiling mischievously at Zoe and David, "I suppose you two have some plans for tonight?" Zoe blushed, exchanging a quick glance with David. "Actually, I was thinking of inviting you two to dinner. We have a lot to discuss about the festival." David smiled, his eyes shining with affection. "Sounds perfect. How about Le Petit Chateau? I can prepare something special for us." An hour later, The three of them were sitting in the cozy kitchen of David's restaurant, savoring a wild mushroom risotto and animatedly discussing their plans for the festival. "So, we've decided it's going to be a 3-day event," Lisa asked, taking a sip of wine. Zoe nodded, feeling energized despite the long day. "Yes, we'll start on Friday evening with a gala reception. David will be preparing dishes inspired by famous books. And on Saturday, we'll have the literary tour of the city, followed by talks and workshops with local authors," David added. Lisa clapped her hands enthusiastically. "And on Sunday, the grand finale with the open-air book market and musical performances." As they discussed the details, Zoe felt a wave of gratitude for having such amazing people by her side. However, the shadow of Marcus' envelope still hung over her. As if reading her thoughts, David placed his hand on hers. "Zoe, about that offer." She took a deep breath, pulling the envelope out of her bag. "I think it's time we faced up to it, don't you?" With trembling hands, Zoe opened the envelope and unfolded the document inside. As her eyes ran over the words, her expression changed from apprehension to shock. "What is it?" Lisa asked, leaning forward with concern. Zoe swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. They've tripled the original offer, and they're offering a management position in the rare books division of Megabooks." Silence fell over the kitchen, heavy and oppressive. David was the first to break it. "Zoe," he said softly, "what are you thinking?" She looked at him, her eyes full of conflict. I don't know." "It's an amount of money that could solve all my financial problems. And the position? It's something I've always dreamed of." Lisa leaned over, taking Zoe's free hand. "But at a cost, right? You'd have to give up stories from the heart." Zoe nodded, feeling tears forming in her eyes. "Yes, and it wouldn't just be the bookshop. It would be all of it. This community, the people, the dreams we've built together." David squeezed her hand gently. "Zoe, no one can make this decision for you, but know that, no matter what you choose, we'll be here for you." Zoe looked at her two best friends, feeling the weight of the decision ahead of her. Financial security and a dream job on the one hand, the heart of her community and an uncertain but love-filled future on the other. "I need time," she finally said, "to think, to really consider what it all means." Lisa and David nodded understandingly. The rest of the evening passed in lighter conversation, but Zoe could feel the weight of the decision hanging over her. Later, as David walked her home, they walked hand in silence. At the door of his house, Zoe turned to him. "David," she began, her voice trembling. He silenced her with a soft kiss. "Shh. You don't have to say anything now. Just know that, no matter what happens, what I feel for you is real. The words in the letters, the moments we've shared, it's all real." Zoe allowed herself to get lost in his embrace for a moment, finding comfort in his warmth. When they finally parted, she saw a mixture of love and concern in his eyes. "Good night, Zoe," he whispered, kissing her forehead. "Good night, David," she replied, watching him walk away before entering the house. Alone in her room, Zoe took out the box containing David's letters. Rereading them in the soft light of the lamp, she felt her heart clench. Each word spoke of a deep love, a connection that went beyond simple romance. With the letters scattered around her and the Megabooks contract on her desk, Zoe found herself at a crossroads. The road ahead was hazy, full of uncertainties and possibilities. As sleep finally claimed her, her dreams were a mixture of books, stolen kisses, and impossible decisions. Tomorrow would bring a new day, and with it, the need to make a choice that would change not only her life, but that of an entire community. Dawn found Zoe sitting at her desk, tired eyes fixed on the megabooks proposal. She had barely slept, her mind a whirlwind of possibilities and doubts. The ticking of the clock seemed deafening in the silence of her home, a constant reminder that time was running out. With a deep sigh, she got up and got ready for another day. Today was the day when preparations for the literary festival would get into full swing, and Zoe knew she needed to be focused, despite the weight of the decision hanging over her shoulders. Arriving at Stories from the Heart, Zoe was greeted by a scene of frenetic activity. Lisa was already there, coordinating a group of volunteers who were hanging banners and setting up stands. "Good morning, boss," Lisa greeted cheerfully, but her smile faltered when she saw Zoe's tired expression. "Hey, are you okay?" Zoe forced a smile. "I'm fine. I just didn't sleep very well." Lisa pulled her to a quieter corner of the store. "It's about the offer, isn't it?" Zoe nodded, feeling the weight of indecision. "Lisa, what if I'm being silly? What if this is my only chance of financial security and doing something really big in the world of books?" Lisa put her hands on Zoe's shoulders, looking her straight in the eye. "Zoe Carter, listen to me. You're already doing something big. Look around you. All these people are here because they believe in you and what this bookshop stands for. That's bigger than any corporate position." Lisa's words touched something deep in Zoe, but before she could respond, the bookstore door opened and David walked in, carrying several boxes. "Good morning, ladies," he called out, his smile faltering slightly as he saw the serious expression on their faces. "Is everything all right?" Zoe exchanged a quick glance with Lisa before forcing another smile. "Everything's fine. What have you got there?" David placed the boxes on the counter. "Just a few surprises for the festival. I thought I'd do a tasting corner with snacks inspired by famous scenes from books." As David explained his idea, showing little cards with book quotes that would accompany each snack, Zoe felt a wave of affection for him. His dedication and creativity were inspiring, and for a moment, all her doubts seemed to disappear. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of activity. Zoe found herself absorbed in the preparations, discussing layouts with Lisa, rehearsing presentations with local authors, and coordinating with other traders in the city who wanted to take part in the event. It was in the middle of the afternoon, while Zoe was organizing a pile of books for a special exhibition, that the doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of an unexpected visitor. "Mom!" David's surprised voice echoed through the store. Zoe turned to see an elegant woman standing in the doorway. Alexandra Matthews was the embodiment of sophistication, from her impeccable suit to her perfect hairstyle. "David, darling," Alexandra said, her voice melodious but with a hint of disapproval. "So this is where you've been spending all your time." David looked uncomfortable, torn between his mother and Zoe. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Alexandra strode into the store, her high heels echoing on the wooden floor. "Well, after our last few conversations, I got worried. I've come to see for myself what's keeping my talented son from his true ambitions." His eyes landed on Zoe, appraising her from top to bottom. "And you must be Zoe. David mentioned you. Briefly." Zoe held out her hand, trying to keep her composure. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Matthews." Alexandra shook her hand briefly before turning her attention back to the bookshop. "So that's why you turned down the offer in Chicago, for a neighborhood bookstore?" David closed his eyes for a moment, as if seeking patience. "Mom, it's not just a bookstore. It's a vital part of this community. And yes, it's one of the reasons I decided to stay." Alexandra laughed, a sound that contained no real humor. "Oh, David, always the romantic. But life isn't a fairy tale. You have an extraordinary talent, a bright future ahead of you. You can't throw it away on a whim." Zoe felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. Was that what she was to David's mother? A whim. David stepped forward, putting himself between his mother and Zoe. "It's not a whim, Mom. It's my life, my choice. I'm happy here." Alexandra sighed dramatically. Happy with what? Serving dinners in a small-town restaurant? Helping out in a bookstore that will probably close its doors in a few months? The silence that followed was deafening. Zoe felt everyone's gaze on her, especially David's, full of concern and unasked questions. It was Lisa who finally broke the tense silence. "With all due respect, Ms. Matthews, Heart Stories isn't going anywhere. We have the support of the entire community, and we're about to hold a literary festival that will put Traverse City on the cultural map." Alexandra arched an eyebrow, clearly not impressed. "A festival? How lovely. I'm sure it will be a lovely event. But in the real world, it's the numbers that matter. And speaking of numbers..." His eyes turned to Zoe. "I hear you've received a very generous offer from Mega Books. Congratulations. It's an opportunity you shouldn't miss." Zoe felt the blood drain from her face. How had Alexandra known about the offer? She looked at David, who seemed as shocked as she was. "Mom," David said, his voice dangerously low, "how do you know about this?" Alexandra smiled, a gesture that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh dear, you know I have my contacts. The business world is small, after all." Zoe stepped forward, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Mrs. Matthews, I appreciate your concern, but the decisions about my business and my life are exactly that. Mine." For a moment, something akin to respect shone in Alexandra's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by her usual expression of superiority. "Well, I hope you make the right decision, dear, for your sake and David's." With that, she turned to leave, but not before casting one last glance at her son. "David, darling, think about what I said. You deserve more than this." After Alexandra left, a heavy silence fell over the bookshop. Zoe felt exposed, vulnerable, as if all her fears and doubts had been laid bare. David approached her, his eyes full of concern and something else. Hurt. "Zoe, I didn't know you were considering the offer from Mega Books." Zoe felt tears forming in her eyes. "David, But before she could continue, the bookshop door opened again. This time, it was Marcus Wellington who entered, his cold smile in place. "Ah, Ms. Carter," he said, his voice full of false cordiality. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything. I just stopped by to see if you've had a chance to consider our offer. The deadline is approaching, you know." Zoe looked from Marcus to David, feeling as if she was being pulled in opposite directions. On the one hand, the promise of financial security and professional recognition. On the other, the love of a community and the possibility of a future with David. She began, her voice trembling slightly. "I need more time." Marcus frowned, all pretense of sympathy disappearing. "Time is a luxury we don't have. Miss Carter, Mega Books is moving ahead with its plans. If you don't accept our offer, well, let's just say things could get difficult for a small independent bookshop." David stepped forward to stand next to Zoe. "That sounds like a threat, Mr. Wellington." Marcus smiled, but the gesture was cold and calculating. "Just an observation on the realities of the market, Mr. Matthews. After all, business is business." With one last meaningful look at Zoe, Marcus left, leaving behind a tension-filled silence. Zoe turned to David, her heart heavy. "David, I'm sorry. I should have told you about the offer." David looked at her, a mixture of hurt and understanding in his eyes. "Why didn't you, Zoe? I thought we were in this together." Zoe felt the tears she had been holding back finally fall. "I was afraid. Afraid of letting you down. Afraid of making the wrong choice. I'm still scared." David pulled her into a tight embrace, and Zoe allowed herself to get lost in his warmth for a moment. When they pulled away, he held her face between his hands. "Zoe, I love you. No matter what you decide, that won't change. But you have to make that choice for yourself, not for me, not for the community, not for anyone else." David's words echoed in her ears, mingling with Marcus, veiled threats, and Alexandra's cutting remarks. Zoe found herself at a crossroads, with the weight of the world on her shoulders. As the sun began to set outside, casting long shadows across the bookshop, Zoe knew the time had come. She needed to make a decision, not just for herself, but for everyone she loved and everything she believed in. With one last look at David and the bookshop that had been her home for so long, Zoe took a deep breath. Tomorrow would bring the first day of the literary festival, and with it, the choice that would define her future. The first ray of morning sunshine found Zoe already awake, sitting at her desk, an untouched cup of coffee by her side. She had been up all night, rereading David's letters, examining the megabooks proposal, and above all, listening to her heart. Today was the day, the first day of the literary festival, and, more importantly, the day she would have to make her final decision. With a deep sigh, Zoe got up, determined to face whatever the day would bring. She dressed carefully, choosing a flowery dress that her grandmother had loved, as a talisman of strength and a reminder of why she had started all this. Arriving at Stories from the Heart, Zoe was greeted by a scene of frenetic activity. Lisa was coordinating a team of volunteers, hanging the last banners and organizing the autograph tables. David was in a corner, setting up an elaborate tasting table with dishes inspired by famous books. "Zoe!" Lisa exclaimed when she saw him. "Thank God you're here. We've got a bit of a problem with the main stage." But before Lisa could continue, David approached, his eyes fixed on Zoe. "Good morning," he said softly. "How are you?" Zoe felt her heart racing under David's intense gaze. "I'm fine," she replied, knowing that he could see through her facade. David nodded, understanding the unspoken. "Whatever you decide, Zoe, we're here for you." With those words, Zoe felt a wave of determination wash over her. She had work to do. The next few hours passed in a flurry of activity. Zoe found herself running around, solving last-minute problems, welcoming guest authors, and making sure everything was perfect for the official opening of the festival. As the crowd began to gather outside the bookshop, Zoe felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. The whole community seemed to be there, from excited children with their favorite books to elderly people eager to share their stories. It was then that she saw them. Marcus Wellington, impeccably dressed as always, watched the scene with a barely concealed expression of disapproval. Next to him, to Zoe's surprise, was Alexandra Matthews, looking out of place and slightly uncomfortable. Taking a deep breath, Zoe climbed onto the small stage set up in front of the bookshop. The murmur of the crowd subsided as everyone turned to listen to her. "Welcome," Zoe began, her voice shaking slightly before gaining strength. "Welcome to the first Traverse City Literary Festival." The crowd applauded enthusiastically, and Zoe felt her heart fill with emotion. "When my grandmother opened this bookstore all those years ago, she had a dream of creating a place where stories could come to life, where the magic of books could touch hearts and change lives. Stories from the Heart is not just a bookshop, it's the beating heart of this community." Zoe paused, her eyes scanning the familiar faces in the crowd. She saw David, his gaze full of love and support. She saw Lisa, smiling through her tears, and she saw the countless customers who had become friends over the years. "In the last few days, I've faced a difficult decision," Zoe continued, her gaze settling briefly on Marcus and Alexandra. "A decision that made me question everything I've built here. But looking at all of you today, I realize that true wealth doesn't lie in lucrative contracts or prestigious positions. It's here, in the connections we form, in the stories we share, in the love we cultivate for this place and this community." Zoe felt tears forming in her eyes, but made no effort to hold them back. Mega Books offered to buy this bookstore. They offered money, security, a seemingly bright future. But what they didn't understand is that some things are priceless. The smile of a child discovering their new favorite book, the twinkle in the eye of an elderly person recalling a beloved story, the thrill of a local author seeing their work on the shelves for the first time. Those are the real rewards of what we do here. The crowd was absolutely silent now, absorbing every word. So my answer is no. I'm not going to sell stories from the heart. I'm not giving up on this dream. Because this place, these stories, all of you, are my heart. And as the old saying goes, the heart wants what the heart wants. With those words, the crowd erupted in applause and shouts of joy. Zoe saw Marcus Wellington narrow his eyes before quickly turning and leaving. Alexandra, surprisingly, remained, a thoughtful expression on her face. Descending from the stage on shaky legs, Zoe was immediately enveloped in a tight hug by David. "You were amazing," he whispered in her ear. "I love you so much, Zoe Carter." Before Zoe could reply, they were interrupted by Alexandra, who approached with hesitant steps. "Miss Carter," she began, her voice devoid of its usual coldness, "I must admit I underestimated you. What you've built here is truly remarkable." Zoe and David exchanged surprised glances before Zoe replied, "Thank you, Mrs. Matthews. That means a lot." Alexandra turned to her son. "David, darling, I'm so sorry. I was so focused on what I thought was best for you that I didn't realize you had already found your place. Your talent shines here in a way that it never would in some pretentious Chicago restaurant." David, visibly moved, hugged his mother. "Thanks, Mom, for understanding." The rest of the day passed in a blur of festive activity. Authors read excerpts from their work. Children took part in creative writing workshops. And David's tasting was a roaring success. In the evening, as the last lights of the festival went down and the last guests left, Zoe found herself alone in the bookshop with David. They were sitting on the small sofa at the back of the store, exhausted but happy. "So," David said, taking Zoe's hand, "what happens now?" Zoe smiled, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. Now we continue writing our story, together." David smiled back, his eyes shining with love and promise. "You know, I still have some letters I haven't had the courage to give you." Zoe laughed, leaning closer to him. "Really? Well, I guess we have all the time in the world for you to show me all of them." As their lips met in a sweet kiss, Zoe felt as if all the pieces of her life were finally falling into place. Stories from the Heart was more than just a bookstore. It was the setting for her very own fairy tale, a story of love, courage, and community. And like all the best books, this story wasn't really ending. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, full of endless possibilities and adventures to come. Outside, the stars shone brightly over Traverse City, and inside the small bookstore on the corner, two hearts beat as one die, ready to face any challenge the future might bring. Because in the end, love for each other, for books and for the community, was the most powerful force of all. And so, surrounded by the scent of old books and new possibilities, Zoe and David began to write the next chapter of their story. A story that, like the best books, promised to be full of adventure, romance, and above all, love. Did this narrative stir your emotions? Don't forget to express your approval with a like. Take advantage of the Super Thanks feature, available just below the video, to offer direct support to the channel and contribute to the production of more fascinating content. Subscribe and remember to activate the bell to stay up to date with all the latest updates. And attention, a new exciting story is already ready to be displayed on your screen. Your participation means a lot to me, and I hope to count on your presence soon. Thank you very much for dedicating your time to this video.